All right, good afternoon, Trinity. If you can hear the sirens in the background, you know it is high noon, just when we said we would hop on here. I've got Mike here. Mike mentioned yesterday at the conclusion of the sermon, or after the sermon really, at the conclusion of our gathering, about getting on here today, Wednesday, and Friday, and talking a little bit more about discipleship, broadly. Some sermon follow-up, and then just getting into that topic a little more fully. And so that's what we'll be doing. We're shooting for 45 minutes or so today, and probably each day this week. So I appreciate those who have tuned in. Feel free to comment, ask questions, let us know things that are helpful, things that have been helpful as you have grown as a disciple in your past. But first, just get the ball rolling. Mike, why are we talking about this topic? Just kind of set the table for us.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's an important topic for us as Christians. Obviously, I don't want to say it's a buzzword. Lots of people, at least lots of Christians anyway, think about being disciples here at Trinity Church. It's one of our core identities. We are family, we are disciples, we are servant missionaries. So it's a pretty common word that gets thrown around in Christian circles a lot, and we just want to talk about it to be clear, to be helpful, to explain what we mean, what it is, that it is a core identity. And then also beyond that, we think it's important because I think sometimes we have an understanding about the discipleship where it's kind of like us growing as disciples, and the focus sometimes, I think inadvertently, but just kind of comes to us about how are we following Jesus. If I could kind of tip my hat to a definition of discipleship is following Jesus, but so it's kind of like centered on our growth, which is definitely an important part of it. But we also want to really, in this conversation or this one in the next few days, just really kind of also move the discussion and include into this discussion the very important aspect of discipleship, that to be a disciple of Jesus is to be involved in disciple making and making disciples of other people. And so that's one of the real impetuses for why we wanted to have this conversation about discipleship, is to, again, not to demean in any way the importance of and the value of us individually following Jesus. That is essential. But we really wanted to include and emphasize and discuss, this idea that we need to be involved in making other disciples, or we need to be involved in the process of making other disciples. And, pretty commonly understood scripture verse there, Matthew 28. We talked about it in the sermon yesterday briefly. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, so go therefore and make disciples." And so if you're going to be a disciple, you also need to be involved in the process of making disciples. And that's really significant for us as a church, as a group, a covenant group of disciples. To be involved in helping one another in the growth process is essential. And it's really an others-oriented focus, and we wanted to raise that awareness and re-emphasize that and have discussions around that. So that's kind of an answer to the question of why it's an important issue. The discipleship in general is an important issue, and we certainly want to have emphasis on here of, what does it mean to be a disciple-making disciple, or being involved in the discipleship process of other people.
So that's good. So using those words, disciple-making disciple, people have definitely come to the table with understandings about what all that means.
Yeah.
Let's get into some of those. What are some common ways, preconceived notions about discipleship? What are we thinking? What about those things that we're probably already thinking are good, bad, questionable?
Yeah, and this would be something too. I don't know if you guys are able to make comments in whatever format you're looking at this. If you're on your computer, it's easy. I know if you're on your phone, it might be a little bit more difficult, but this would be a great time if people wanted to jump in here and make a few comments just on some common understandings of what discipleship is, just so that we kind of are aware of the playing field, so to speak. And when I say this, I don't mean to be demeaning of any of these things at all. I'm being very careful to say these aren't necessarily misunderstandings of discipleship. It's just commonly understand. We kind of, knowledge and learning is kind of going from where you are, what you do know, what's familiar, to what you don't know, to what's more or less unfamiliar. And so that's just why we want to ask this question right now. So yeah, definitely common understandings of discipleship. People think about growth for sure. So just about Christian, when they think about discipleship, they think about Christian growth. And as I said, that's an important part. That is one understanding of discipleship. Another one, Matthew 28. Matthew 28, go make disciples. And so a lot of people, when they think about discipleship, they actually kind of think of it in terms of evangelism, of talking to people who don't know Jesus or who haven't surrendered their life to Jesus, and talking to them and seeking to persuade them and encourage them to become followers of Jesus. So in that sense, discipleship is almost evangelism. I actually think that's a really healthy way to understand evangelism, of telling people the good news about Jesus. Think of it always in the terms of process of becoming a disciple. It's never just about, I think it's an author named Scott McKnight, Jesus didn't come to get converts, he came to make disciples. And so, in a sense, evangelism is just step one of the process of discipleship. So, but that's a commonly understood way to think about discipleship, is just the Great Commission and telling people who don't know about Jesus or who haven't surrendered their life to Jesus about him. So Christian people think about Christian growth. They also think about evangelism when they think about discipleship. Sometimes when people think about discipleship, they run very quickly to methods of discipleship. And so you can find popular books and important books on like one-on-one discipleship, or small group discipleship, like 3 or 4 men, 3 or 4 ladies. You can find like books on communal or corporate discipleship, church discipleship. And so when you get into a conversation about discipleship, a lot of times people go to the method of it, and this method or that method. And again, methods is going to be a very important aspect of this conversation. It's a good understanding to have. But I would certainly say it's not the full picture. We need to have a more full-orbed, robust idea about what discipleship is. Discipleship cannot be boiled down to any one of those methods I just said. It's not just, does discipleship happen on Sunday morning in the big, large gathering? Absolutely, discipleship happens there. Does discipleship happen in one-on-one settings in a coffee shop? I think that's kind of like the modern middle-class suburban way of discipleship. Hey, let's go get coffee together, and that's discipleship. It's like, well, okay, that discipleship certainly can happen there, but So a lot of times when people, we get this conversation going, people want to immediately jump to methods, and we're going to talk about methods, maybe not a whole lot today, but methods are crucial, but it's not all that there is to understanding a full picture of discipleship. Things I've covered, it's just common understandings. People think of Christian growth, people think about even evangelism, people think about methods when they talk about discipleship. So I don't know, was there any other ones that you wanted to add to that or follow-up questions?
No, I think that's good. I mean, obviously method is crucial and important, and you have to have a method. If you don't have a method, then you're not actually doing anything.
Yeah.
But keeping those two separate, singing and worship, is one I think that's, one of the things we do, when we love to gather on Sundays, is to sing. And sometimes that gets boiled down to worship,
right?
Whereas it is something we do to worship, but it's not all of that. So just meeting somebody one-on-one, just attending a gospel community gathering, none of that stuff is actually discipleship. It could be a great place for that to take place, but we need to keep those things separate and still connected, which we'll get to, as you said, later in the week.
Yeah.
So getting to defining discipleship, what we're actually talking about, let's get a definition for that, and also let's start using some biblical terms as well. Is discipleship something that we actually see in the Bible as a term? Talk a little bit about the term.
Absolutely. So even when you start thinking about Bible study, if I could put in here just a word to help those who are watching, and maybe you could help others, which that would be discipleship. It'd be amazing. Discipleship, or any Bible study in general, it's probably good to start with Jesus and see which direction he goes with it. And in a sense, you're following Jesus in that way. And so when we think about the concept of discipleship, what does Jesus say about it? He kind of gives us a general idea of what discipleship is in Luke chapter 6, verses 39 and 40. He told them a parable also. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? Kind of a humorous parable there. And then Jesus said, a disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. And so I think that's a really good definition, just very simple and very clear, of what discipleship is. Discipleship is this process of learning. That's actually what the Greek word, another synonym for the Greek word. The Greek word is mathetes, and it can be translated learner. There's definitely someone who is, in a sense, more mature, more knowledgeable, more experience, more character, just they're further along the path, if you will, and they share what they know so that the one who is learning will become like the teacher. Now, it's very important, the word like there. You don't become the exact, and this is going to be important when we talk about the biblical theology of this, but you become like. There's a transformation that takes place. There's a conformity, a shaping. Again, it's not an exact thing necessarily, but there is a really strong likeness. Mark chapter 8 and verse 34 is, again, I think the Luke one is really clear. I think the Mark 34 one, or Mark 8:34 is helpful as well. And he called to him the crowd with the disciples and said to them, if anyone would come after me. So discipleship there, he talks about denying your cross and denying yourself, taking up your cross, which we're going to get to that later. But just in essence, he's talking to his disciples and he's saying, you must come after me, which means to follow, which means to observe and to apply and those type of things. So definition of discipleship is just becoming like a leader, becoming like someone that you would follow. And not an exact replication necessarily, but a likeness to. And so that's really what discipleship is. And so when you put that general definition into the biblical storyline, you start to find some really interesting and fascinating things. So the biblical storyline, Trinity, we talk about, actually, if you signed on here before you were in the waiting room, you saw it: creation, fall, redemption, recreation. The biblical storyline begins with God creating the world. The pinnacle of that creation is man and woman, and he creates man and woman in his likeness, in his image. And so really that's where discipleship begins. Discipleship begins when God decides to create human beings in his image, in his likeness, and we therefore are to become like him. Now again, that's where it's very important. We're not becoming exactly him. I had a quote yesterday from the church father Athanasius. He's one of my favorite church fathers. I don't know that many church fathers, but when I was in seminary, I wrote a paper on him, so I liked him. His quote was that God became like us in order that we might become like him. That's a discipleship quote. And so going back to the first question, why would we talk about this? When you put it in that context, it's like, wow, this is really important. This is very fundamental and core to who I am as a human being, the purpose of why I exist. There's a huge, not huge, you could say there's an elephant in the room in this discussion. I mean, what question is begging to be asked in one sense is, this is a huge conversation for parenting. Parenting is discipleship, and we could just hijack the whole thing and just turn this into a parenting conversation. But here's God creating man in his image and in his likeness, and we are to become like him. We are to be representatives, image bearers. God's design was to fill his created world with his glory, and he was going to do that by populating this created world with image bearers who reflected his likeness all throughout the creation. And so that was Adam and Eve's charge. They were to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth with image bearers who would faithfully and accurately reflect and fruitfully reflect the goodness, the glory, and their relationship with the Creator God.
Yeah, I mean, when you say parenting is discipleship, I think there's some really intuitive kind of observations that even leads us to. I mean, you can pull that outside of the Christian context and see it really clearly, where parents raise their children. There's going to be similar interests, similar passions, desires, likes, dislikes, all of those types of things. So one of the things, I know that we've talked about in the past, always discipling. You're always learning and chasing after someone, something, some vision, some picture, and you're always sort of bringing other people and evangelizing them, so to speak, into what you are passionate about and following. So when you say parenting, that kind of, that makes me think of that.
Yeah, we were created to be imitators. And so we become like what we behold. That's a title of a book written by Greg Beale. He also has a really clever sentence that I think is memorable. He says that what we revere, we resemble, either for restoration or ruin. So again, just to put that quote out there, a bunch of R's. What we revere, value, honor, worship, we end up resembling. Okay, we become like what we revere, and then that has consequences, either for restoration or for ruin. So, again, kind of going back to the storyline, we'll talk more about always being disciples and disciple making more in just a minute. But kind of going back to the storyline, so when we talk about the definition of a general definition of following Jesus, of becoming like Jesus, being shaped by him, that has roots all the way in the created order. And so we were created, in a sense, to have this relationship face to face. God walked with Adam and Eve in the garden, and as they got to know God more and more, and they grew in their understanding and relationship with him, they would become more and more like him, and they would rule and subdue and fill the earth with his likeness and with his values and according to his will. If you're, a Christian and a student of the Bible, of course, you know that Adam and Eve turned, as it were, their faces away from God. They wanted to become their own gods. And so when that happened, the image of God was broken. It was shattered. It wasn't totally obliterated and, annihilated. The image of God still remained, but it was corrupted and fallen. And so, we turned our faces, instead of to the Creator, we turned them to the creation. And, and that has certain consequences. And so we started revering and valuing and honoring things that weren't God. And when that happens, our hearts get twisted and broken and hard and dead, is what the Old Testament scriptures say. Actually, a really important scripture on this, and actually, Dan, I didn't give you this one. It's Psalm 115. Psalm 115 is where this idea that we become like what we behold is really rooted. And Psalm 115 says, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and faithfulness. Why should the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases." In contrast, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but they don't speak. They have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have noses, but they don't smell. They have hands, but they don't feel. Feet, but they don't walk. And they do not make a sound in their throat. And then the key in verse 8, "Those who make them become like them, so also those who trust in them." So that's a really strong passage. And what he's saying is, he's not saying that human beings, in a sense, become idols of wood and stone, like a physiological transformation in that way. But what the psalmist is getting at there is that the idea of having eyes but not seeing, having ears but not hearing, having hands but not feeling, that's what our relationship with the true God becomes like. As human beings gave themselves over to things that they valued more than the Creator, what they do is that gradually leads to a corruption and a hardening of heart from the true and living God. And so we can no longer see what's really important. We can no longer hear what's really important. Our sense of what our feeling is important, that's all broken and shattered. And then that leads to all kinds of greed and abuse and violence and anger and all the isms, racism, classism, sexism. All of that flows out of, from a biblical understanding, is from a broken discipleship, if you can put it that way. We were made to know and to show God. That's discipleship. And when we turned away from Him, that this is the product of what we see in our life. The brokenness, corruption, decay, and death is actually, and you could accurately say that it is the product of broken discipleship. So, whenever you're studying something, so we took this topic of discipleship. I want to kind of pause here, also give you a comment on method. We started with Jesus, and now we're going to the storyline of the Bible. Jesus kind of gave us the working definition of discipleship, and now we're going through the story of the Bible. And so Israel, Adam and Israel failed in this. They turned their face from God. And so Adam was the first son of God. Israel was the corporate son of God. And so now you want to get to Jesus. Again, we return to Him, and He is the true Son of God. And what Jesus is He is the exact likeness. That's actually Hebrews chapter 1. He actually transcends the common general definition where you kind of become like your teacher. Jesus actually is the exact representation of God. That's Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Probably worth reading those since we're just doing a little Bible study format here. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Long ago and at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. Now here it is, verse 3. He, Jesus, is He's the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature. That is capital U, ultimate discipleship. Jesus actually is the exact representation. What is God exactly like? Jesus came, and as we talked about in the sermon yesterday, in His incarnation, He came in human form. So, this is the storyline of the Bible: creation, fall, and now restoration through the person of Jesus Christ. The original intent of a human being in the image of God and representing God faithfully is now possible. It's being fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. And so actually when Jesus says, "Follow me," it's very analogous to the original creation of man and women in the image of God. When God said, He created them by the word of His power and said, "Be like me, represent me," and Jesus comes on the scene and says, "Follow me," it's the exact same, it's the fulfillment. It's the fulfillment of Genesis 1. And so discipleship now moves from, a common understanding, which is good, but needs to be more fully robust. It's, I need to grow and to kind of become like Jesus. Yes, that's true, but you put it in the storyline of the Bible, you see how important and really cosmic discipleship is. Creation, fall, restoration in Jesus. So now people who are connected to Jesus are being restored in the image of God, and they're being restored to the very purpose of what it means to be a human being. And so we're going to see that discipleship is a process. We'll talk about that. But then the final aspect of the way we would kind of see the storyline of the Bible is the new creation, the recreation of all things. And in the end, and this is from 1 John chapter... before I go to 1 John, let me just make one more comment from Colossians chapter 3 on Jesus as the likeness of God and our likeness in Him. Colossians 3, see if I can find it here in my Bible. Colossians chapter 3. Starting in verse 5, Paul's going to tell the church to put off certain things, behavior, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, covetousness. All that's idolatry. Again, valuing and worshiping other things leads to these corrupt practices. And it leads, verse 6, to the wrath of God. In these two, verse 7, you once walked, but now, when you were living in them, but now you must put them away, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing you have put off the old self and its practices, and you have put on the new self. The old self and the new self correspond to Adam. He was the original. He's the old man, and he rebelled against God and led to corruption. Jesus is the new Adam, the new self. We put him on, and what is he like? You put on the new self, which is being renewed in the knowledge after the image of its creator. And there it is, Jesus coming in the image of God. We put him on, and when we put Jesus on, when we're connected to him spiritually and by faith, a whole new way of living, of being human, enters our lives and the lives of people around us. So the church, really, being a Christian is a new way, the proper way, the fulfilling way of what it meant for God for us to be, what God meant for us to be human. So again, that's the restoration part. And then the final part of discipleship here, when you look at the storyline of the Bible, creation, fall, redemption, new creation, is in 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. And in that section of Scripture, we see the final fulfillment of discipleship, and we also get a really good glimpse into the process of discipleship. So 1 John chapter 3, verse 1 says, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us. This is amazing love, that we should be called the children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him. Why? Because we shall see him as he is." And so the fulfillment of discipleship is at the return of Christ. And when we see him for who he fully and truly is, we too will be transformed and we will become like him, fully like him, in the sense of no more impurity and no more sin. And we know that's what John is aiming at, because at the end of verse 3, he says, "Everyone who has this hope of seeing Jesus face to face purifies himself even as Jesus is pure." That process has already begun. It's interesting and it's exciting to note that the process of becoming like Jesus in that end is already started right now. That's already started. It's going to get a massive boost at his second coming when we truly see him, but the process has already begun right now. So when we think about what discipleship is, kind of going back to our definition and some of the common understandings of it, we see a lot of them are good. So the idea of Christian growth is hugely important to discipleship. But you just want to be sure to see it in a bigger framework, so that you see how important it is and that this has been part of the plan of God all along.
Yeah, I think that's significant when you're and I'll just reiterate that, when you see that in the grand storyline of the Bible, what you're seeing is you're not seeing a fad, for sure.
Right.
You're not seeing a contemporary practice. You're not seeing something where it becomes less optional. And not that it ever was optional in reality, but
right.
A lot of times we can live in practice as if it were optional and almost pull being a Christian away from growing in discipleship.
Yeah.
Which there is no, is no reality to that.
We want to be really clear at Trinity. We don't think Christian and discipleship, they're separated somehow.
Right.
This person's a real disciple, I'm just a Christian. No. Yeah. To be a Christian is to be a disciple. Actually, the word Christian, if we were careful with the word itself, it means little Christ. It actually is implied, the idea of discipleship in there. I see a question there from Adrian. So could we say that discipleship is the original plan for man and woman? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say that even has implications for the new heavens and new earth. Our discipleship process, from every indication I see in Scripture, doesn't stop at the second coming. The infinite glory of God, we can never plumb the depths of that. We will continue to grow kind of in a state of perfection and what it means to relate, to know, and reflect the glory of God in the kingdom of God forever. So, yeah, great question there.
And I think that going back to another thing you said, I think that's why it has to be so closely rooted in becoming like the one who created you. Going back to what you were in Psalm there. Because as we are further conformed, there is an eternal end to that, and there is like this, this process long beyond what we're currently experiencing in part. And so, I think when you place it in terms of following and becoming like Christ, now there's, it's definable, and yet it goes on. And so I think, the storyline really is helpful there,
it gives us clarity of what we're doing, but it doesn't limit it.
Right.
There's this grand scope. There's, in a sense, I like to say, for me, where I'm at in my own quote-unquote discipleship, my own becoming like Jesus, part of me is discouraged because I don't feel like I'm changed very quickly, or I may not see a lot of progress. And so that can be discouraging, but in one sense it's encouraging because it's like I've barely scratched the surface of what it means to know and to become like Jesus and to be able to reflect him. And so it's like, well, at least this isn't all there is. There's a lot more of Christian discipleship. There's a lot more of Christ to experience and to become like him. With that big storyline in place, I did want to jump back to something that you introduced, Dan, a few minutes ago, which is this idea of discipling is always happening. And you just briefly mentioned that maybe 5-7 minutes ago or whatever. And I want to reiterate this to us as for those listening in the church, that discipleship is kind of like worship. and sometimes when we think of worship, sometimes people will say like, "Oh, the worship was great on Sunday," and I know what people mean, and I'm not judging them for it. And the person who says that knows what they mean as well. It's like they usually refer to that as the singing time, but we know, and we've said it many times at this church, that all of life is worship. So you're always worshiping because God made you as a worshiper. It's part of your identity. You're always valuing something or someone, and that's what worship is. It's the highest value. Discipleship is similar. Because you are made in the image of God, you're always, in a sense, following or imitating someone or something else. And because you live in a community and other people are watching you, you're always, imaging something, and other people are either following or rejecting. And so, in one sense, you're always being discipled, and in another sense, you're always discipling. And to go back to the original, we want to be a church that's, that we are disciples, but we're also disciple-making disciples. Well, that's almost redundant. It's like, of course we're a disciple-making church because we're always making disciples one way or the other. It's like, again, to go back to the parenting analogy, you are teaching your kids every single day, either by what you are actively doing or what you are not doing, but you're still teaching them. You're setting an example one way or the other. So Trinity Church, we want to be a disciple-making church. Well, newsflash, we are. The real question is what kind of disciples are we making? And so that's really the question we want to ask. And you think of a verse like Romans 12, 1 and 2. It says, "Do not be conformed to this world." Okay, Romans, and that word conformed is a discipleship word because discipleship is about formation, transformation, or being conformed to the image of Jesus. So it's that the shaping and the forming word is a discipleship word. So Paul says, it's there in verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world," which means the world is consistently and continually seeking to shape you according to its values, its ethics, its practices, all of those things. The world is constantly trying to disciple you. I didn't have it here, but what I wanted to show you guys, and maybe we'll put up a graphic on Facebook or something, I don't know, making no promises, but you guys have probably seen some of those ads from like the 1950s in the newspapers and the good life, and we kind of chuckle at them when we think, oh, look how we're kind of like pat those old 1950s peoples on their head and like, oh, we're condescending to them, like we're so much more advanced. Well, newsflash, 50 years from now, people are going to like look at the ads that we had of the good life, and they're going to think the same things about us. Now, my point in that is to say this. We see how those ads were trying to shape the American culture about what the good life is. Well, again, we need to be really aware and really careful. The news that we watch, the movies that we watch, the music that we listen to, the commentators that we interact with, the books that we read, the articles that we read, the things that come across our social media pages, all of that is discipleship. Dan and I were talking before this, before this discussion here, the curated news. People are filtering what they want you to see. That's discipleship. We need to be aware that there are people and forces and influence that are seeking to shape you according to the mold of this world. So discipleship is happening. As believers in Jesus, we need to actively resist the shaping, the fear. A lot of the fear and pride are the two main motivators in the human life. Here's the good life. Pursue that. That's a form of discipleship. Watch out and be afraid of these things. And so that either the fear or the pride is seeking to shape your life. And so as Christians, we reject that, and to go back to the Romans 12, but instead be transformed by the renewal of your mind into the likeness of Jesus. Transformation where we fear what Jesus tells us to fear. We value what Jesus tells us to value. His view of the good life is what true life really is. And so I want to make that point. The storyline of the Bible of discipleship teaches us this one very, very important thing, and that is that discipleship is always happening. The issue is, are we discipling people according to Jesus and the kingdom of God, or are we being discipled by the world?
About a book recommendation on that. James K. Smith wrote a book, You Are What You Love.
Yeah.
And in there, he argues a lot that we are not fundamentally just thinking things, but we are beings that love and desire and go after. And he does a really good job he puts it in terms of liturgy. There's a secular liturgy, and there's, of course, a Christian liturgy. And he even goes into things like shopping malls, how shopping malls are preaching to you, an appeal to come and live the good life. He uses that terminology all the time. So that's James K. Smith, You Are What You Love. I found that really helpful.
There's also, he's got some lectures. If you don't want to read the whole book, if you YouTube James K.A. Smith, You Are What You Live.
No, come on. No, we're watching enough.
Okay,
we can
fine.
read.
Dan says you have to read. I'm sorry, Dan says you have to read.
No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
He is great in those videos. He always wears shirts with crazy collars too, so he's a great watch. But
yeah. So just to kind of, we got just a couple minutes left here, so I just want to make a couple comments on process before. So we're not going to really get to methods today. I didn't think we probably would, but when you talk about methods of corporate or communal discipleship, it's important. They got the whole one-on-one. Even that's a form of communal discipleship. You think about not just, what was I trying to say? Not just the communal aspects of it, but the practices of like prayer or fasting or Bible reading. All those things we need to discuss, and hopefully in the coming days we will, and try to grab some other folks in on some of these conversations as well through this week. But on the process of discipleship, it was hinted at in the 1 John 3 passage, where we become like him. We will be like him because we will see him as he is. And another really significant verse on that is in 2 Corinthians 3:18, where Paul says something very similar that John did, and he says that we are being changed into his image. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, and we all, with an unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. So one of the things that we need to get really straight and really clear at the outset when you think about process. The process of discipleship is actually a supernatural one. Dan talked, you said in the beginning, there's kind of a secular, or I would say a general way of discipleship. Like, for example, my father was an electrician, and he was in a union, and he was in an apprenticeship program for a number of years, and so there would be, masters and journeymen, and he would learn from them, and he would grow in his understanding, and that's an important process, and it's a wonderful thing, apprenticeships and mentorships in that way, but that's not like a spiritual transformation. In order to genuinely become a disciple of Jesus, to be transformed into his image, requires, as you saw the way Paul says it in 2 Corinthians there, an unveiled face. The blinders have to be removed. Again, going back to the Old Testament, because we've given ourselves to idols, we're blind. We can't see. We can't hear. We need the initiating and transforming grace of Jesus Christ that comes miraculously and powerfully. When someone, it's amazing, when the gospel gets preached and the words, in a sense, come with the power of the Holy Spirit, that message has the power to open people's spiritual eyes. It's an amazing privilege, Trinity. Tell someone about Jesus this week. That's what I'm praying for myself, praying for you guys. But so in that, the spiritual transformation has to take place in our lives. We have to hear and see Jesus consistently, which, is going to inform our practices of whether it's a Sunday morning discipleship opportunity or it's a one-on-one, or again, whatever method we're talking about. The actual process of what actually has to happen is people seeing and beholding Jesus Christ. That's the important issue.
Just in support of that, I was reading in this little, one of these 9 Marks little books on discipling, and talking about how following Christ and being a disciple of him is distinct in that, because it doesn't begin with some sort of assertion on my part, but it begins with something that God actually does.
Yes.
So he says, being a disciple of Christ, in other words, does not begin with something we do. It begins with something Christ did. Jesus is the good shepherd who laid down his life for his sheep. He loved the church, gave himself up for her. He paid the debt that he didn't owe, but that we owe, and then united us to himself as his holy people. And so I appreciate that point. This is a spiritual dynamic. It's not simply a mechanical dynamic of us getting to know and learning the skills and characteristics of someone that we follow, but there's a spiritual dynamic here that begins as Jesus says, "Follow me," and we are awakened to that reality.
Yeah. So it's important, Trinity. So we're going to talk more about process. We're going to talk more about methods for sure. Those things are important, but we want to, as we close out this first conversation about process and just reaffirming what Dan is saying there, this is something that, where God comes and seeks and saves the lost. He comes and makes disciples. Even Jesus, when he says to his disciples in the upper room, he says, "Remember, you didn't choose me, but I chose you." It was his initiating work that brought them into this transformed relationship with himself and therefore with God, and begun that process of remaking them in his image. And so, part of the privilege for that for us is now God is still doing the same thing, Trinity, in Central Delaware and around the world. He is seeking and saving the lost. He is going after them. And you know how he's doing it? He's doing it through us. He's doing it through you. When Jesus says, "Go make disciples," and then he says, "I am with you to the end of the age," who's making the disciples? One plants and other waters, but it's God who gives the increase. And so it's our joy and privilege to join Jesus in his will and in his plan to fill the earth with image bearers, because he is sending us as the church into Central Delaware. Good news, you don't have to change one thing about your current life right now to be a disciple and a disciple-making disciple. You don't have to change one thing other than maybe your focus and your intentionality and your surrenderedness to Jesus. But you don't have to change your job. You don't have to change your location. COVID-19 is not going to thwart Jesus' plans of discipleship. So the good news, Trinity, is that Jesus is still in the disciple-making business, and he's been doing for 2,000 years, he's doing it in and through his people, his church. And so we get the privilege and the responsibility of being a part of that. So thanks for being with us today. Hopefully this conversation was helpful and encouraging to you. We look forward to coming back on Wednesday. We'll talk a little bit more about process, some more about methods. We'll dig into some more things about Jesus-specific comments in the Gospels about discipleship. So there's a lot still more to talk about and to dig into. So thanks for being with us. We'll put in the comments below some of the resources that we mentioned. We'll put that there. So if you want to find those, you'll be able to get those there. Have a wonderful day, Trinity.